I'm not ashamed.
What would happen to those who ate leaven during the Feast of Unleavened Bread? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Exodus on walking through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Exodus chapter 12. We're going to be reading from verses 18 to 20. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Exodus chapter 12, beginning at verse 18. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. In this chapter, God has been giving Moses instructions concerning the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Passover would remind Israel of the night where God passed over their houses and spared their firstborn, while at the same time killing the firstborn in Egypt. The reason God passed over their houses is because he saw the blood of the lamb on their doorposts and lintel. For this feast, they were to kill a 1-year-old lamb without blemish, roast it with fire, and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The entire meal was to be eaten that night, nothing left until morning. Whatever was left in the morning was to be burned with fire. They were to eat of this feast prepared to go, for they would shortly be leaving Egypt. As for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that feast would coincide with the Passover and would commemorate God bringing up Israel out of Egypt. We'll find that the reason that this feast was to be observed with unleavened bread was because God was to bring them up out of Egypt quickly. Thus, any bread that they made would not have time to rise. Thus, God commanded them to eat unleavened bread. What we found in the last episode, and have repeated today, is that they were to have no leaven in their houses during this festival. On a symbolic level, leaven is almost exclusively seen in Scripture as a representation of sin. So by purging out the leaven from their houses, they were showing how God delivered them to new life by bringing them out of Egypt. Christians are to do the same thing spiritually today. Now, oftentimes, because we don't have these regulations today, nor do we observe these feasts, we don't look at the labels of things. Because we don't look at the label of things, we don't realize what foods that we eat have leaven in them. You see, it's not just the leavening agent that wasn't to be in their houses, but any food that contained a leavening agent. These would include all foods that contained yeast, baking powders, and baking sodas. It would be interesting for the viewers of this podcast to go to their pantries and fridges and just see what foods would have to be removed from our houses if this restriction had been in place today. I once entered a Jewish grocery store during the Passover time, and it was amazing to see how bare the shelves were. Fermented wine would also have to be removed, which is how we know that the fruit of the vine that Jesus used in instituting the Lord's Supper was unfermented grape juice. The Feast of Unleavened Bread lasted for 7 days. Thus, when including the Passover, made the entire period an 8-day festival. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and on the 7th day, there would be a holy convocation or assembly to the Lord where worship would take place. On these days, no work was to be done except that which was necessary to make the food to be eaten of that day. Coming now to verse 18, we find when this feast was to begin. If you recall, the Passover was on the 14th day of the first month. The lamb would be killed towards the end of the 14th day of that month. Verse 18 says that from the 14th day of the month at evening until the 21st day of the month at evening, they would only eat unleavened bread, signifying the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, we have stressed all along that the Jewish day began at sundown, so it would appear that this feast actually began before the Passover meal with the lamb being eaten. But such interpretation cannot be true, for we know from Exodus 13 that the Lord brought them out of Egypt on the 15th day of the first month, the day after the Passover meal was eaten. So what does verse 18 mean? It is talking about the end of the 14th day of the first month at evening, which is actually the beginning of the 15th day, and ending at the close of the 21st day of the month, which is actually the beginning of the 22nd day. Even though this might be confusing to us, it would be apparent to those whom this law was given to, and discernible to us simply by reading the entire context of chapters 12 and 13. What would happen to those people who did not follow the restrictions on leaven and ate something leavened during this feast, that person would be cut off from the congregation of Israel. To be cut off from the congregation means to lose the rights and privileges of being an Israelite and the blessings of the covenant made between God and Israel. This would be true of the stranger in the land as well as the native in the land. The phrase being cut off is used 36 times with regard to different laws that God gave the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, with the first time being in Genesis 17:14 concerning circumcision. So important was this feast to God, for he always wanted Israel to remember that God was the one who delivered them from Egypt, that he threatened this harsh penalty for those who disobeyed this ordinance. With that, our time is up for today. Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 to 28, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
I'm not ashamed.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of